Engineer Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cool metal of the docking tube's wall, feeling the subtle vibrations that told her they were almost there. Through the reinforced viewport, the Galactic Alliance's flagship Eternal Dominion stretched beyond her field of vision like a metallic mountain range floating in the void. She had seen the technical specifications, had studied every blueprint the Alliance had been willing to share, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer overwhelming presence of the vessel. "Nervous?" Captain Rodriguez asked from beside her, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile or a grimace. Sarah shook her head, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Excited. Terrified. Both, I think." She adjusted the strap of her engineering toolkit, the familiar weight providing some comfort. 5 years of academy training, 3 years working on our best destroyers, and I still feel like I'm about to board something out of a dream. The transport shuttle Pequod had been dwarfed the moment they'd entered the Eternal Dominion's docking bay. Sarah had watched through the pilot's display as they'd passed through what she now realized was just one of dozens of similar bays, each one capable of housing a small fleet. The Alliance had built their flagship on a scale that defied human comprehension, and Sarah was about to become the first human engineer ever granted access to its inner workings. The docking clamps engaged with a series of metallic thuds that reverberated through the hull. Captain Rodriguez straightened his uniform and turned to Sarah with an expression she'd never seen before, something between pride and protective concern. "Remember, Engineer Chen, you're not just representing yourself or even the Pequod. You're representing all of humanity." The Alliance Council debated for months before agreeing to this exchange program. Some of them still think we're too primitive to understand their technology. Sarah felt her spine stiffen. She'd heard the whispers, seen the condescending looks from some of the Alliance species during her orientation sessions on Kepler Station. Humans were the newcomers, the species that had stumbled into faster-than-light travel barely 50 years ago while most Alliance members had been exploring the galaxy for millennia. To many, humans were curiosities at best, potential threats at worst. "I won't let them down, sir. Or you." The airlock cycled with a hiss that seemed to go on forever. Sarah's ears popped as the atmospheric processors equalized pressure between the two vessels. Then, the inner door slid open, and Sarah got her first glimpse of the Eternal Dominion's interior. The docking bay stretched away from them in all directions, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Dozens of smaller craft were berthed in organized rows, sleek Alliance fighters that looked more like works of art than weapons of war, supply shuttles with hull designs Sarah didn't recognize, and stranger vessels that seemed to bend light around their edges. The air hummed with the sound of machinery and the chatter of dozens of different species going about their duties. But what struck Sarah most wasn't the size or the technology, it was the elegance. Every surface was smooth and flowing, as if the entire bay had been carved from a single piece of metal by an artist's hand. Soft bioluminescent strips provided lighting that seemed to respond to movement, brightening as beings passed beneath them and dimming to conserve energy when areas were empty. The very walls seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm Sarah realized matched the ship's power systems. "Magnificent, isn't it?" The voice came from their left, speaking perfect English with only the faintest accent that might have been Altarian. Sarah turned to see a tall, graceful being approaching them with fluid steps that barely seemed to touch the deck. The newcomer had the elongated limbs and pale blue skin of a Xanathi, one of the Alliance's founding species. "Engineer Chen, Captain Rodriguez, welcome aboard the Eternal Dominion. I am Senior Engineer Veltar Kasef. I will be your guide and, I hope, your colleague during your stay with us." Sarah extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, then quickly withdrew it as she remembered that not all species shared the custom. But Veltar surprised her by reaching out with a hand that had 2 extra fingers and gently clasping her palm. "We have studied human customs in preparation for your arrival. Though I confess, the concept of physical contact as greeting is unusual to us." "Thank you for accommodating us," Sarah replied, impressed despite herself. "I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. Your ship is incredible." Veltar's large, dark eyes seemed to shimmer with what Sarah thought might be amusement. "This is merely the docking bay, Engineer Chen. Wait until you see the engineering sections." They began walking deeper into the ship, passing through corridors that seemed to reshape themselves as they moved. Sarah noticed that the walls actually were moving, adjusting their configuration to accommodate the flow of traffic. When a group of insectoid hive mind workers approached from the opposite direction, the corridor widened. When they passed a junction where a massive Kronar engineer was working on some kind of maintenance panel, the ceiling raised itself to accommodate his 12-foot height. The ship's hull is composed of programmable matter, Veltar explained, noticing Sarah's fascination. It responds to the needs of its inhabitants and can reconfigure itself for optimal efficiency. The entire vessel is, in a sense, alive. Sarah's engineering mind raced with questions, but she forced herself to focus on the present moment. They passed through what Veltar identified as one of the ship's main thoroughfares, a vast corridor that seemed to stretch for miles in both directions. Moving walkways carried beings of dozens of different species at various speeds, while others flew or floated using methods Sarah couldn't immediately identify. "How many crew members does the Eternal Dominion carry?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "At full capacity, approximately 2 million sentient beings," Veltar replied casually, as if discussing the weather. "Though we are currently operating at about 60% of that, as we are between major campaigns." Sarah tried to wrap her mind around the number. The largest human starships carried crews of maybe 10,000. 2 million beings living and working together in a single vessel was beyond her experience. They entered what Veltar called a transit hub, a spherical chamber where dozens of transport pods moved through the air in complex patterns that somehow never resulted in collisions. The pods moved along invisible paths, following what Sarah assumed were magnetic fields or some other force she couldn't detect. "We'll take a pod to the engineering section," Veltar said, gesturing toward an approaching transport that seemed to be made of the same flowing metal as the rest of the ship. "I thought you might appreciate seeing our power generation facilities first." The pod sealed around them with no visible door or seam, creating a transparent sphere that gave them a complete view of their journey. As they accelerated through the ship's transit system, Sarah pressed her face to the curved wall and stared in amazement at the Eternal Dominion's internal structure. The ship wasn't built like human vessels, with discrete decks and compartments. Instead, it seemed to be organized in vast, flowing spaces that served multiple purposes. She saw what looked like hydroponics bays that stretched for miles, their growing plants providing both food and atmosphere processing. Recreational areas that seemed to simulate different planetary environments floated in zero-gravity bubbles. Manufacturing centers where robotic systems and living beings worked side by side to create everything from spare parts to works of art. "Your ship doesn't just transport a crew," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to her companions. "It transports an entire civilization." "An astute observation," Veltar said. "The Eternal Dominion is designed for extended deep space missions that may last decades or even centuries. Everyone aboard must be able to live full, meaningful lives during those journeys. We have schools, research facilities, entertainment complexes, even wilderness preserves where beings can experience nature." The pod began to slow, and Sarah could see their destination ahead. The engineering section of the Eternal Dominion was a vast spherical chamber at the ship's heart, surrounded by smaller spheres and connecting tubes that pulsed with energy. As they approached, Sarah could see that the entire structure was in constant motion, rotating and reconfiguring itself in patterns that suggested some kind of optimization process. "Behold," Veltar said with evident pride, "the heart of our vessel. The quantum fusion cores that power the Eternal Dominion." The pod docked at a platform that extended from one of the smaller spheres, and they disembarked into an environment that assaulted Sarah's senses. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy, and she could feel the hair on her arms standing up from the electromagnetic fields. But, more than that, there was a sense of vast, contained power all around them. The walls hummed with energy transfers that dwarfed anything Sarah had ever experienced. Veltar led them to an observation deck that looked down into the main fusion chamber. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the miniature star contained within fields of force that bent light around their edges. The fusion reaction wasn't the simple hydrogen-helium process that powered human ships. This was something far more complex, involving matter states she didn't recognize and energy patterns that seemed to violate several laws of physics she thought were universal constants. "Each of our 7 primary cores generates approximately 10 to the 18th watts of power," Veltar explained. "The secondary cores provide another order of magnitude beyond that for emergency situations." Sarah's mind went blank for a moment. The numbers were so large they ceased to have meaning. The largest human fusion reactor generated about 10 to the 10th watts. This single ship carried power generation capabilities that exceeded the total output of Earth's entire electrical grid by factors she couldn't calculate without help. That's... She started, then stopped. That's impossible. I mean, the containment fields alone would require more energy than they could produce. For the first time since meeting her, Veltar's expression showed something that might have been surprise. You understand the containment problem. Most species require several centuries of development before they grasp the fundamental paradox of high-yield fusion. Sarah felt a flush of pride, but it was quickly overwhelmed by humility as she realized how much she didn't know. We've been working on the problem for decades. Our best theoretical physicists think it might be solvable, but we've never seen a working example. The solution involves principles that your species hasn't discovered yet, Veltar said gently. But the fact that you've identified the problem suggests that you will, given time. They continued their tour through the engineering sections, and Sarah began to understand why the Alliance had been reluctant to share their technology. It wasn't just that human science wasn't advanced enough to understand it, it was that the technology was so far beyond human capabilities that it might as well have been magic. The computer systems that controlled the ship's operations were based on quantum neural networks that processed information in ways Sarah's brain couldn't follow. The artificial gravity was generated by manipulating spacetime itself rather than through rotation or acceleration. The faster-than-light drive didn't move the ship at all, it moved space around the ship, carrying the vessel along in a bubble of altered reality. But, as they walked in, Veltar explained system after system, Sarah began to notice something that surprised her. For all their advanced technology, the Alliance engineers had the same fundamental problems that human engineers faced. They dealt with system failures, maintenance schedules, resource allocation, and the eternal struggle between optimal design and practical limitations. Your species approaches engineering differently than most Alliance members, Veltar observed as they paused at a monitoring station where Sarah had asked several detailed questions about power distribution efficiency. Most of our member species focus on elegance and theoretical perfection. You seem more concerned with practical functionality. Sarah considered the observation. Humans have a saying, if it works, it's not stupid. We tend to build things that solve problems, even if they're not pretty or theoretically optimal. Interesting. Perhaps that perspective could be valuable to us. They were interrupted by a soft chime that seemed to come from the air itself. Veltar paused, his large eyes unfocusing as he apparently received some kind of communication through methods Sarah couldn't detect. I apologize, but there is a situation that requires my attention, he said after a moment. One of our secondary fusion cores is experiencing fluctuations that our systems cannot explain. Engineer Chen, would you be interested in observing how we handle such problems? Sarah's pulse quickened. This was beyond her wildest hopes. Not only was she being allowed to observe Alliance technology, but she might get to see their problem-solving methods in action. They took another transport pod to a different section of the engineering complex, this one smaller but no less impressive than the main fusion chamber. As they approached, Sarah could see that the normal smooth flow of energy patterns was disrupted by irregular pulses that sent ripples through the containment fields. A team of Alliance engineers was already at work, beings from several different species working with tools and displays that seemed to respond to thought as much as physical manipulation. Sarah watched in fascination as they analyzed data streams that flowed through the air as visible patterns of light and color. The fluctuations began approximately 30 minutes ago, the lead engineer, a crystalline being whose species Sarah didn't recognize, reported to Veltar. All primary systems show normal parameters, but the quantum resonance patterns are shifting in ways our models cannot predict. Veltar studied the data displays, his expression growing concerned. Have you attempted a resonance reset? Negative effect. If anything, the fluctuations have increased in amplitude. Sarah found herself studying the patterns of energy flow, her mind automatically trying to diagnose the problem. She had no understanding of the underlying technology, but the patterns themselves reminded her of something familiar. Veltar, she said hesitantly, may I ask a question? The Xanathi engineer turned to her with an expression of polite attention. Of course. The fluctuations, they're not random, are they? There's a pattern, but it's not following your normal harmonics. Several of the Alliance engineers turned to look at her, and Sarah felt a moment of panic. She was vastly out of her depth, surrounded by beings whose understanding of physics made her look like a child playing with building blocks. But Veltar's expression was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "You observe correctly. The patterns do show organization, but they do not match any of our known resonance modes. What does this suggest to you?" Sarah took a deep breath and decided to trust her instincts. On human ships, we sometimes see something like this when we have harmonic interference between different systems. It's not that any one system is broken, it's that two or more systems are creating a combined effect that doesn't match what any of them should produce individually. The crystalline engineer made us sound like wind chimes in a storm. Harmonic interference between separate systems? But our isolation protocols prevent such interactions. What if the isolation isn't perfect? Sarah suggested, warming to her theme. Or what if there's a new interaction that your protocols weren't designed to handle? Veltar was studying the data with renewed intensity. "Engineer Chen, you may be onto something. We have been treating this as a problem with the fusion core itself. But if the issue is interaction with another system..." He began manipulating the displays in ways that made Sarah's eyes water, calling up data streams that showed the relationship between different parts of the ship. Gradually, a pattern emerged that made the crystalline engineer's harmonic sounds shift to what Sarah interpreted as excitement. "The new navigation array," Veltar breathed. "We installed it just last week, and it operates on quantum frequencies that are very close to our fusion resonance patterns." Within minutes, the Alliance engineers had isolated the problem and implemented a solution that involved adjusting the phase relationships between the two systems. The fluctuations in the fusion core smoothed out, returning to the elegant pattern Sarah had observed earlier. "Remarkable," the crystalline engineer said, turning to Sarah with what she assumed was approval. "Your species' approach to systematic diagnosis is quite effective. We were so focused on the theoretical perfection of our systems that we failed to consider practical interaction effects." Sarah felt a glow of pride, but it was tempered by humility. "I just applied basic troubleshooting principles. You did all the hard work of actually fixing the problem." "Do not diminish your contribution," Veltar said seriously. "You identified a possibility that none of us had considered, despite our collective centuries of experience with these systems. Perhaps there is more that our species can learn from each other than the Alliance Council originally anticipated." As they prepared to continue the tour, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. She had always known that humans were newcomers to the galactic community, that their technology was primitive compared to the great civilizations of the Alliance. But perhaps that wasn't the complete picture. Perhaps being newcomers gave humans perspectives that the established species had lost somewhere in their millennia of technological development. The Eternal Dominion was a marvel of engineering that surpassed human capabilities in every measurable way. But it was still, at its heart, a machine built and operated by living beings trying to solve problems and accomplish goals. And, in that fundamental challenge, Sarah was beginning to think, humans might have something valuable to contribute after all. The next few weeks aboard the Eternal Dominion passed in a blur of discovery and wonder. Sarah found herself assigned to a mixed engineering team that included beings from 7 different species, each bringing their own unique perspectives and abilities to their shared work. Veltar had arranged for her to have access to learning systems that could download basic technical information directly into her mind, though she found the process disorienting and preferred to learn through hands-on experience. The ship itself became her classroom and laboratory. During her designated rest periods, she explored the vast corridors and chambers, always discovering something new. She visited the bio-neural processing centers where living computers grown from modified brain tissue performed calculations too complex for traditional electronics. She watched in amazement as the ship's self-repair systems deployed microscopic robots that could rebuild damaged sections down to the molecular level. She observed the environmental systems that maintained dozens of different atmospheric compositions simultaneously, allowing species with wildly different physiological needs to live and work together. But it was in the secondary engineering labs that Sarah began to make her real mark. The Alliance engineers had assigned her to work on what they considered minor problems, system optimizations, efficiency improvements, and routine maintenance procedures. They expected her to observe and learn, not to contribute meaningfully to their work. They had underestimated human stubbornness. The plasma flow regulators in Section C-47 are operating at only 73% efficiency, Sarah reported to her team leader, a six-armed hexapod engineer named Crix who had initially been skeptical of having a human on his team. That is within acceptable parameters, Crix replied, his multiple eyes focused on a more pressing problem with the ship's defensive grid. We do not optimize systems unless they fall below 60% efficiency. But, why not? Sarah asked, a question that seemed to puzzle the alien engineer. If we can improve the efficiency by 27%, that's energy we could use elsewhere. And if we apply the same improvements to all the plasma regulators throughout the ship? She called up a holographic display and began running calculations, her fingers moving across interfaces that had required weeks to learn. Look, if we optimize all the plasma systems, we could free up approximately 3% of the ship's total power output. That's enough to run an entire secondary city module. Crix turned all six eyes toward her display, his expression unreadable. The modifications you suggest would require significant time and resources to implement. The current system functions adequately. But, adequately isn't the same as optimally, Sarah insisted. On human ships, we're constantly looking for ways to improve efficiency because we can't afford to waste anything. Every percentage point matters when you're operating at the edge of your capabilities. She spent the next several days developing her proposal, working with the ship's design systems to model the potential improvements. The Alliance technology made her work both easier and more frustrating. The computers could simulate her modifications with perfect accuracy, but the results challenged assumptions that Alliance engineers had held for centuries. Your proposed modifications are theoretically sound, Veltar admitted when she presented her findings to a larger group of senior engineers. But they represent a fundamental shift in design philosophy. Alliance vessels are built with substantial redundancy and safety margins. We prioritize reliability over maximum efficiency. I understand that, Sarah replied, but what if we could have both? My modifications don't reduce safety margins, they just eliminate waste in systems that are already performing safely. She highlighted section after section of her analysis, showing how minor adjustments to plasma flow patterns, power routing algorithms, and system timing could yield significant improvements without compromising the ship's safety or reliability. The human has identified inefficiencies that we had categorized as acceptable losses, admitted the crystalline engineer, whose name Sarah had learned was resonance of deep caverns. Perhaps our definition of acceptable has become too accepting. The debate continued for several hours, with engineers from different species bringing their own perspectives to bear on Sarah's proposals. The HiveMind engineers were intrigued by the collective benefits of system-wide optimization. The methodical Altarians wanted extensive testing before implementation. The pragmatic Kronar supported any modifications that would give them more power to work with. In the end, they decided on a limited trial implementation in one of the ship's secondary power grids. If Sarah's modifications proved successful without negative side effects, they would consider broader application. The trial exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only did efficiency improve by the projected amount, but the optimized systems showed increased stability and reduced wear on critical components. Word of the successful modifications spread through the engineering departments, and Sarah found herself receiving requests for consultation on optimization projects throughout the ship. But her growing reputation also attracted less welcome attention. The human engineer is disrupting established procedures, complained senior engineer Thax Aller, a pompous Altarian who had opposed Sarah's presence from the beginning. Her constant suggestions for improvements show disrespect for millennia of Alliance engineering tradition. The complaint was brought before the ship's engineering council, a body that included the senior engineering staff from all departments. Sarah found herself standing in a circular chamber surrounded by beings whose technological knowledge dwarfed her own, defending not just her work but her right to contribute to the ship's operations. Engineer Chen, said the council's presiding officer, an ancient Xanathi whose pale blue skin showed the intricate scarification patterns that marked centuries of service, you have been aboard the Eternal Dominion for less than one standard month. Do you believe that in such a short time, you have gained understanding that surpasses engineers who have worked with these systems for decades? Sarah felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Every human who might follow in her footsteps depended on how she handled this moment. But she also knew that backing down now would validate every stereotype about human inferiority that had led to resistance against the exchange program. "No, honored engineer," she replied carefully. "I don't claim to understand your technology better than those who designed and built it. But I do see it differently, and sometimes a different perspective can reveal possibilities that familiarity might obscure." She activated the chamber's display systems, calling up examples of her optimization work. "Every modification I've proposed has been tested and verified by your own systems. I haven't challenged the fundamental design principles of alliance technology, I've simply suggested ways to implement those principles more efficiently." "But why is efficiency so important to you?" asked another council member, a massive Kronar whose voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Our ships have power and resources far beyond our needs. Why seek optimization when abundance already exists?" The question struck to the heart of something Sarah had been thinking about for weeks. "Because efficiency isn't just about having more power or resources," she said. "It's about not wasting what you have. On human ships, we optimize everything because we have to. Our technology isn't advanced enough to afford waste. But that necessity has taught us to see opportunities for improvement everywhere." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Your ships are magnificent, but they could be more magnificent. Your technology is incredible, but it could be more incredible. Just because something works well doesn't mean it can't work better." The chamber fell silent as the council members considered her words. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, the weight of judgment being passed not just on her but on her entire species. "You speak of seeing opportunities," the presiding officer said finally. "What opportunities do you see that we have missed?" Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would either vindicate her presence on the ship or end her participation in the exchange program immediately. "I see a ship that could be 20% more efficient across all systems," she said. "I see power distribution networks that could be optimized to reduce energy loss by 15%. I see maintenance procedures that could be streamlined to save thousands of hours of work each month. I see manufacturing processes that could be improved to produce higher quality components with less resource expenditure." The council members stirred at her words, some showing interest, others displaying what Sarah interpreted as skepticism or alarm. "But more than that," she continued, "I see the possibility of learning from each other in ways that make all of us better engineers. Human methods aren't superior to alliance methods, they're different. And different approaches to the same problems can lead to solutions that neither side would discover alone." She highlighted specific examples from her work, showing how human diagnostic techniques had identified problems that alliance sensors had missed, how human optimization principles had improved the performance of alliance systems, and how alliance technology had expanded the possibilities for human engineering approaches. "The fusion core problem that we solved on my first day wasn't solved by human technology or alliance technology alone," she pointed out. "It was solved by combining different ways of thinking about the problem. I identified the possibility of harmonic interference because human engineers are trained to look for system interactions. Your engineers implemented the solution because they understood the quantum mechanics involved." Veltar spoke up from his position in the council circle. "The human's observations are correct. Her contributions have resulted in measurable improvements to ship performance. More importantly, her different perspective has challenged us to reconsider assumptions we had taken for granted." "And yet," Thaxalar interjected, "she has been aboard for less than 1 month and claims to see improvements that we have missed for years. Does this not suggest either incompetence on our part or arrogance on hers?" Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "With respect, Senior Engineer Thaxalar, it doesn't suggest either. It suggests that sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see possibilities that experience might overlook. How many innovations in Alliance history came from junior engineers or from contact with new species that brought different perspectives?" The question hit its mark. Sarah had studied Alliance history during her journey to the Eternal Dominion, and she knew that many of their greatest technological leaps had come from exactly such encounters. The debate continued for hours, with council members questioning Sarah about every aspect of her work and her understanding of Alliance systems. They tested her knowledge, challenged her assumptions, and forced her to defend every suggestion she had made. But, gradually, she realized that the tone of the questioning was shifting from hostility to genuine curiosity. "You propose to optimize systems shipwide," the presiding officer said eventually. "Such an undertaking would require resources and personnel from every department. It would disrupt established procedures and require extensive testing and validation. Why should we undertake such an effort for marginal gains?" "Because marginal gains add up," Sarah replied. "A 2% improvement here, a 3% improvement there, and, suddenly, you have a ship that performs significantly better than before. But, more importantly, because the process of optimization teaches us things about our systems that we might not learn otherwise." She called up data from her recent work, showing how the optimization process had revealed previously unknown system interactions, identified potential failure modes before they could cause problems, and led to innovations that went beyond simple efficiency improvements. "The real value isn't just the improvements themselves," she explained. "It's what we learn while making those improvements. Every optimization project teaches us something new about how our systems work, and that knowledge leads to better designs in the future." The council deliberated for what felt like hours while Sarah waited in an adjoining chamber. Veltar remained with her, offering what comfort he could, but even he seemed uncertain about the outcome. "You have challenged them to think differently," he said. "Some will see that as valuable. Others will see it as threatening. The question is which perspective will prevail." When they were called back to the council chamber, Sarah could tell nothing from the expressions of the assembled engineers. The presiding officer stood and addressed her directly. "Engineer Chen, this council has reached a decision regarding your proposals and your continued participation in the exchange program." Sarah's heart hammered as she waited for the verdict that would determine not just her own future but the future of human participation in Alliance technology sharing. "Your optimization proposals will be implemented shipwide over the next 6 months, the presiding officer announced. "You will lead a joint team of human and Alliance engineers in this effort. Your methods will be studied and documented for potential application across the Alliance fleet." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and excitement. But the presiding officer wasn't finished. "More importantly, your approach to engineering challenges has convinced this council that the exchange program should be expanded. We recommend to Alliance Command that human engineers be assigned to other vessels and that Alliance engineers be sent to work with human fleets. The combination of our different perspectives appears to have significant potential for advancing the technological capabilities of both our civilizations." As the council session ended and the various engineers began to disperse, Veltar approached Sarah with what she had learned to recognize as a Xanathi expression of deep satisfaction. "You have accomplished something remarkable," he said. "In 1 month, you have changed how the Alliance thinks about human capabilities. More than that, you have changed how we think about the value of different perspectives in solving engineering challenges." Sarah looked around the chamber, at the advanced technology that surrounded her and the alien beings who had just voted to trust her with their most sophisticated systems. A month ago, she had been just another human engineer, competent but unremarkable. Now she was pioneering a new form of cooperation between species that could benefit entire civilizations. But she also knew that the real work was just beginning. Implementing shipwide optimizations would require careful planning, extensive testing, and the cooperation of thousands of beings from dozens of different species. She would need to prove that her methods could scale beyond small demonstration projects to shipwide implementations that affected millions of lives. As she began planning for the challenges ahead, Sarah realized that she was no longer just representing humanity aboard the Eternal Dominion. She was helping to build bridges between civilizations that could lead to advances neither could achieve alone. The awe she had felt upon first boarding the massive warship had evolved into something deeper, a sense of purpose and possibility that would drive her work for years to come. 6 months later, the Eternal Dominion was no longer the same ship that Sarah had first boarded. The optimization program had succeeded beyond everyone's expectations, improving overall efficiency by nearly 30% and uncovering dozens of previously unknown system interactions. But, more importantly, the process had fundamentally changed how the Alliance approached engineering challenges. Sarah stood in the main engineering control center, watching as her mixed-species teams conducted the final tests on the last phase of optimizations. The chamber buzzed with activity as beings from a dozen different worlds worked together, combining their unique perspectives and abilities to solve problems that none of them could have tackled alone. Power distribution efficiency is now at 94%, reported Crix, the hexapod engineer who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters. His 6 arms worked simultaneously at different control interfaces while his multiple eyes monitored readouts throughout the chamber. That's a 21% improvement over baseline. Structural integrity is optimal across all sections, added resonance of deep caverns, the crystalline engineer whose harmonic communication methods had proven invaluable for detecting system resonances that conventional sensors missed. The new load balancing algorithms have eliminated the stress concentrations we identified in the original design. Sarah nodded with satisfaction, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. Through the control center's massive viewports, she could see the sleek forms of 3 human destroyers keeping pace with the Eternal Dominion. Aboard each of those ships were Alliance engineers participating in the reverse exchange program that had grown out of her initial success. Incoming transmission from the UES Indomitable, announced the communications officer, a multi-tentacle aquatic whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns as well as sound. The main display showed Captain Rodriguez's weathered face, but he was no longer alone. Standing beside him was Senior Engineer Thax Aller, the Altarian who had initially opposed Sarah's presence aboard the Eternal Dominion. The transformation in his attitude had been one of the most surprising developments of the entire program. Engineer Chen, Captain Rodriguez began, I wanted to personally thank you for what you've accomplished. The modifications that Engineer Thax Aller has implemented on our ships have increased our combat effectiveness by 40%. More importantly, they've taught us new ways to think about our own technology. Thax Aller stepped forward, his usual pompous demeanor replaced by something that might have been humility. I owe you an apology, Engineer Chen. My initial resistance to your ideas was based on prejudice rather than rational evaluation. Your approach to optimization has revealed possibilities in human technology that we had not considered. Your ships are crude by Alliance standards, but they are also remarkably efficient and adaptable. Sarah felt a surge of pride, not just for herself but for her entire species. Thank you, Senior Engineer. I think we've all learned that different doesn't mean inferior, it just means different. And different perspectives can lead to innovations that none of us would achieve alone. The transmission continued with technical reports from all 3 human vessels. Alliance engineers had not only improved the performance of human systems but had begun developing entirely new technologies that combined human and Alliance approaches. Fusion reactors that used human efficiency optimization principles with Alliance containment technology were producing unprecedented power outputs. Navigation systems that merged human intuitive problem-solving with Alliance quantum processing were proving more accurate and reliable than either approach alone. But the most significant development was happening on a scale far beyond individual ships or even fleets. The success of the exchange program had led to formal technology sharing agreements between the human government and the Alliance Council. Joint research stations were being established. Mixed species crews were becoming common on exploration vessels. The entire relationship between humanity and the galactic community was evolving from junior membership toward true partnership. There's something else, Captain Rodriguez said as the technical reports concluded. Admiral Singh wanted me to inform you personally that you've been promoted to Chief Engineering Officer of the Joint Human Alliance Task Force that's being formed. You'll be working directly with Alliance Command to implement optimization programs across both fleets. Sarah felt a moment of vertigo as the implications sank in. She had come aboard the Eternal Dominion as a junior engineer on an exchange program. Now she was being offered a position that would make her one of the most influential engineers in human space. But before she could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the engineering center. The steady hum of normal operations was replaced by the urgent tones that indicated a shipwide emergency. Report, Veltar called out, his calm voice cutting through the chaos as engineering teams rushed to their stations. Massive gravitational anomaly detected on our current heading, responded the sensor operator, an insectoid being whose compound eyes could process visual data far faster than any other species. Whatever it is, it's not natural. The distortion patterns suggest artificial construction on a massive scale. Sarah moved to her own station, calling up the sensor data on her displays. What she saw made her stomach lurch with a combination of terror and awe. The gravitational readings showed an object that dwarfed even the Eternal Dominion, something so massive that it was bending spacetime around itself in ways that created visible distortions in the starfield beyond. "It's a ship," she breathed, hardly believing her own words. "But it's impossible. Nothing that big could maintain structural integrity, even with Alliance technology." Veltar was studying the readings with an expression of growing alarm. "Those energy signatures. I've seen them before, in the archives. This matches the sensor profiles of the ancient ones." The engineering center fell silent at his words. Sarah had heard whispers about the ancient ones during her time aboard the Eternal Dominion, a mysterious species that had supposedly vanished from the galaxy millions of years ago, leaving behind only ruins that defied all attempts at analysis. "I thought they were just legends," someone whispered. "So did we all," Veltar replied grimly. "But the evidence before us suggests otherwise." The massive vessel, if that's what it was, remained motionless as the Eternal Dominion and its escort ships approached. Long-range scans revealed a structure that seemed to be constructed from materials that didn't match anything in Alliance databases. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at covered its hull, and energy readings fluctuated in patterns that suggested technologies far beyond current understanding. "We're receiving a transmission," the communications officer announced, tentacles flashing in patterns that indicated extreme agitation. "But it's not coming through normal channels. It's being transmitted directly to our minds." Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation, and, suddenly, words formed in her consciousness without passing through her ears. The voice was ancient beyond measure, carrying with it the weight of eons and the sadness of empires fallen to dust. "Young builders of metal and dream, the voice said, we have watched your growth with interest. Your species, both the clever primates and their careful allies, show promise that has not been seen in this galaxy for many cycles, the presence in their minds paused, and Sarah could sense vast intelligence examining them with the thoroughness of a scientist studying interesting specimens. "You have begun to learn the first lesson, that diversity of thought leads to strength of solution. This is wisdom that your predecessors failed to grasp before they fell to the entropy of certainty." Images flashed through Sarah's consciousness, vast cities that span star systems, technologies that could reshape matter at the quantum level, civilizations that had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe. But also images of stagnation, of species so certain of their superiority that they stopped growing, stopped learning, stopped adapting to new challenges. "We offer you a choice," the ancient voice continued. "We can share with you the accumulated knowledge of our civilization, technologies that would advance your development by millions of years. But knowledge without wisdom leads only to destruction. The price of our gift is that you must continue to grow, continue to learn, continue to embrace the perspectives of others unlike yourselves." Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was a decision that would affect not just the Alliance and humanity, but the future development of galactic civilization. Accept the offer, and both species would gain capabilities beyond imagination. Reject it, and they would continue their slow but steady development through cooperation and mutual learning. But, as she considered the choice, Sarah realized that she already knew the answer. The past 6 months had taught her that the most valuable discoveries came not from having all the answers handed to you, but from working together to find new solutions to challenging problems. The process of collaboration, of combining different perspectives and approaches, was as important as the results it produced. "Honored Ancient," she said aloud, knowing somehow that her words would reach the vast intelligence examining them, "we are grateful for your offer. But we choose to continue learning and growing together. The knowledge we gain through our own efforts, through cooperation and mutual understanding, will be more valuable to us than any gift, no matter how advanced." She felt approval radiating from the ancient presence, along with something that might have been relief. "Wisdom indeed," the voice said. "You have chosen the path that leads to true advancement rather than the shortcut that leads to stagnation. We will watch your progress with great interest." The massive vessel began to fade, not moving away but simply becoming less real, as if it existed in dimensions beyond normal spacetime. Within moments, it had vanished completely, leaving only empty space where moments before an impossible structure had challenged the laws of physics. "Did that really happen?" someone asked in the silence that followed. "The sensor logs confirm it," Veltar replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But, more importantly, Engineer Chen's response confirms that we have chosen the correct path forward. We will continue to learn and grow through cooperation rather than seeking easy answers from those who came before us. In the weeks that followed, news of the encounter spread throughout the Alliance and human space. Rather than dismay at the lost opportunity, both civilizations felt a renewed sense of purpose and confidence in their chosen path of mutual cooperation. The exchange programs expanded rapidly, with engineers, scientists, and explorers from dozens of species working together on projects that none could have attempted alone. Sarah accepted her promotion and threw herself into the work of building bridges between civilizations. The optimization techniques that had started as simple efficiency improvements evolved into comprehensive approaches to problem solving that combined the best insights from multiple species. Research teams that included humans began making breakthroughs in fields that had been stagnant for centuries, while Alliance knowledge helped humanity leapfrog technological barriers that might have taken decades to overcome through conventional development. But, perhaps the most important change was cultural rather than technological. The success of interspecies cooperation aboard the Eternal Dominion and the human vessels had demonstrated that diversity of thought was not just valuable but essential for continued growth and advancement. What had started as a simple engineering exchange program had evolved into a new model for galactic civilization, one based on mutual respect, shared learning, and the understanding that different perspectives could lead to solutions that no single species could achieve alone. Years later, as Sarah stood on the bridge of the first jointly designed human Alliance vessel, watching as it prepared for its maiden voyage to explore the unknown regions beyond the galactic rim, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had boarded the Eternal Dominion as a junior engineer hoping to learn about advanced alien technology. She was leaving it as one of the architects of a new form of interspecies cooperation that would shape the future of the galaxy. The massive warship that had once seemed like the pinnacle of technological achievement now seemed like just the beginning. With dozens of species working together, sharing their unique perspectives and approaches to common challenges, there was no limit to what they might accomplish. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, but they would face them together, learning and growing and building something greater than any of them could achieve alone. As the joint fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and leaped toward the unknown, Sarah felt the same sense of awe that had overwhelmed her on that first day aboard the Eternal Dominion. But it was no longer awe at the achievements of others, it was awe at the infinite possibilities that lay ahead for all of them, working together as partners in the greatest adventure of all, the exploration of the universe itself.